A word of warning. My true crime is intended for adults. We may discuss disturbing cases, so viewer discretion is advised. Thank you. Hello, my true crime buddies. Welcome to another episode of my true crime. I have already put a disclaimer on the beginning of this video. However, this episode is very graphic. It's very, very tragic, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, shocking to the core. I have heard of this case before, so please do be warned. It does involve child abuse, extreme child abuse. So feel free, if you want to miss this episode, that's absolutely fine. It's completely your discretion. I'm just warning you. This episode is going to be a long one with all the research that I have done. I have left details in, graphic details in. I did toy with taking them out to make it not so graphic and just give you the general picture. But I honestly believe Sylvia's story needs to be told. Not only because these things happen, hopefully to not this degree, but child abuse does go on. She was let down by a lot of people. I will be putting my opinions in along the way. Usually I wait to the end and sort of talk about it, but with this case I think it's best to do it along the way. I won't comment how shocking it is because it speaks for itself. Just be warned. I am working on my Diamond Art Club Miss Havisham, so feel free to grab a project. Come join me for a Halloween version. I have released this on the anniversary because my heart goes out to Sylvia. I'm getting upset now I haven't even started. Okay. Again, I am going to name this after Sylvia Likens, the victim, because I believe her story needs to be told. However, this case sometimes comes under Gertrude Banaszewski. I think that's how you say it. Okay, so I'm going to begin with her. Gertrude Van Vossen was born on September the 19th in 1928. She was born in Indianapolis, in Indiana, to Molly and Hugh, both of whom were originally from Illinois and were of American and Dutch descent. Gertrude was the third of 6 children, and her family was working class. On the 5th of October in 1939, Gertrude saw her 50-year-old father die from a sudden heart attack. And by all accounts, she was really close to her dad. Not so close to her mum, but really close to the dad, so that hit her quite hard. 6 years later, she dropped out of high school at the age of 16, and she married 18-year-old John Banaszewski. John was originally from Pennsylvania and was of Polish ancestry, and she had 4 children with him. John did have a volatile temper and occasionally beat his wife, and the two would remain together for 10 years prior to getting a divorce. Following her divorce, Gertrude then married a man named Edward Guthrie. This marriage lasted only 3 months before the couple divorced. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude remarried her first husband and had 2 more children with him, and then they divorced for a second time in 1963. Weeks after her third divorce, and she began a relationship with a 22-year-old named Dennis Lee Wright, who also physically abused her. She had 1 child with Dennis, and she named the child exactly the same name with a junior on the end. Shortly after the birth of his son, Daddy Dennis abandoned Gertrude. Gertrude then filed a paternity suit against Daddy Dennis for financial support of their child, although Daddy Dennis seldom was able to pay for the upkeep of their son. By 1965, Gertrude lived alone with her 7 children. Paula is 17, Stephanie is 15, John 12, Marie 11, Shirley 10, James 8, and Dennis Jr. 1, and their ages are at the time of this event, I do believe. She was just 36 years old. She was 5 feet 6 inches in height, and she weighed only 100 pounds, which is 45 kilograms, and had been described as, quote, haggard, underweight, and asthmatic. She was a chain smoker suffering from depression due to the stress of 3 failed marriages, a failed relationship, a recent miscarriage, and no doubt struggling to keep 7 children going along with herself, I guess. In addition to the sporadic checks she received from her first husband, who was a former Indianapolis policeman, and she relied upon his financial support for the children. Gertrude occasionally performed odd jobs for neighbours and acquaintances, such as sewing or cleaning, in order to earn a couple of extra dollars, because we're in America. Gertrude lived in Indianapolis at 3850 East New York Street, where the monthly rent was $55. Can't imagine that now, can you? Okay, so now Sylvia Marie Likens was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers Lester and his wife Elizabeth, who was also known as Betty, so I shall refer to her as Betty. She was born between 2 sets of fraternal twins, Daniel and Diana, 2 years older than Sylvia, and Benny and Jenny, who were 1 year younger. Her younger sister Jenny suffered from polio, causing one of her legs to be weaker than the other. She was afflicted with a notable limp and had to wear a steel brace on one leg. Lester and Betty's marriage was unstable. They often sold candy, beer and soda at carnival stands around Indiana throughout the summer, moving frequently and regularly, experiencing severe financial difficulties. Their sons regularly travelled with them in order to assist with their job, but Sylvia and Jenny were discouraged from doing the same out of concern for their safety and education. As a result, both sisters frequently stayed with their relatives, often their grandmother. In her teenage years, Sylvia occasionally earned spending money by babysitting, running errands, or performing ironing chores for friends and neighbours, often giving her mother part of her earnings. Sylvia has been described as a friendly, confident, lively girl with long, wavy, light brown hair extending below her shoulders, and was known to friends as Cookie. Although exuberant, Sylvia always kept her mouth closed when smiling due to a missing front tooth, which she had lost while roughhousing with one of her brothers in a childhood game. She also had a fondness for music, in particular the Beatles, and was notably protective of her more timid and insecure younger sister, Jenny. On several occasions, the two sisters would visit a local skating rink where Sylvia would help Jenny skate by holding her hand while Jenny skated on her unaffected foot. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny resided with their parents in Indianapolis. On the 3rd of July, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting, which is quite sad because she was probably doing it in order to try and help the family. But it is wrong, but she was jailed. Shortly after, Lester arranged for his daughters to stay with Gertrude. This came about because two of the girls who the sisters had recently become friends with while at high school, I believe it was Paula and Stephanie. So they were friends, and as we know, they're travelling around in the carnival and looking for someone to look after the girls, basically. At the time of this agreement, Gertrude assured Lester she would care for his daughters until his return, as if they were her own children. And this turns my stomach because what is about to happen, it makes me angry, very, very angry. Shortly after the July 4th holiday, the two sisters moved into 3850 East New York Street in order for their father and later their mother to travel to the East Coast with the carnival, with the understanding that Gertrude would receive a weekly fee of $20 to care for their daughters until they returned to collect Sylvia and Jenny in November of that year. So we are talking, 4th of July. So July, August, September, October, November, 4 months. She had to look after them for 4 months. That puts a timeline on about I keep getting upset and I do apologise. Okay. During the initial weeks in which Sylvia and Jenny resided at their household, the sisters were subjected to very little discipline or abuse. Sylvia regularly sang along to pop records with Stephanie, and she willingly participated in housework for Gertrude, just by way of gratitude, I guess. Both girls also regularly attended Sunday school with the Banaszewski children, with the pastor commendating Sylvia's acts of kindness. Okay, again, a warning here. This is about to get very graphic, extremely graphic. I have kept the details in purely to show the scale of abuse. You have been warned. Although Lester had agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week in exchange for the care of his daughters, after approximately 2 weeks, these payments failed to consistently arrive upon the prearranged dates, occasionally arriving 1 or 2 days late. Now we're talking a couple of days. If he was going weeks without paying, this doesn't justify anything. I can understand Gertrude getting annoyed, and what is she going to do? She's kind of not stuck with him, I guess, but yeah, here we go. Now, because they're arriving late, in response, Gertrude began venting her frustration at this fact upon the sisters by beating their bare bottoms with various instruments, such as a 1/4 inch thick paddle, making statements such as, quote, "Well, I took care of you two little beep for a week for nothing." On one occasion, in late August, both girls were beaten approximately 15 times on the back with the paddle after Paula had accused the sisters of eating too much food at a church supper of the household children had attended. By mid-August 1965, Gertrude had begun to focus her abuse almost exclusively upon Sylvia, with her primary motivation likely being jealousy of her physical appearance and potential in life. According to subsequent trial testimony, this abuse was initially inflicted upon Sylvia after she and Jenny had returned to the Banaszewski residence from school, as well as on weekends. The initial abuse included subjecting Sylvia to beatings and starvation, forcing her to eat leftovers or spoiled food out of garbage cans. On one occasion, Sylvia was accused of stealing candy she had actually purchased. On another occasion, in late August, Sylvia was subjected to humiliation when she claimed to have a boyfriend in Long Beach whom she had met in the spring of 1965 when her family lived in California. In response to hearing this, Gertrude asked if she had, quote, ever done anything with a boy, to which Sylvia, unsure of her meaning, replied, "I guess so," and offered that she had gone skating with the boys there and had once gone to a park on the beach with them and Jenny. Continuing the conversation with Stephanie and Jenny, Sylvia mentioned that she had once laid under the covers with her boyfriend. Upon hearing this, Gertrude asked, quote, "Why did you do that, Sylvia?" Which she replied, "I don't know," and shrugged. Several days later, Gertrude returned to the subject again with Sylvia, telling her, quote, "You're certainly getting big in the stomach, Sylvia. Looks like you're going to have a baby." Sylvia thought Gertrude was kidding with her and said, quote, "Yeah, it sure is getting big. I'm just going to have to go on a diet." However, Gertrude then informed her and the other girls in the house that whenever they did something with a boy, they were sure to have a baby. Then she kicked Sylvia in the genitals. Paula, herself overweight, and this is the most ironic thing, she's taken this out on Sylvia for some strange reason, but Paula, who is 17, is 3 months pregnant, and Paula is also jealous of Sylvia's physical appearance, and then Paula began participating in attacking her, knocking her off the chair onto the kitchen floor, shouting, quote, "You ain't fit to sit on a chair." On another occasion, as the family ate supper, Gertrude, Paula, and a neighbourhood boy named Randy Lepper force-fed Sylvia a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard, ketchup, and spices. Sylvia vomited as a result and was later forced to consume what she had regurgitated. In what was Sylvia's only act of retaliation, she alleged to have spread a rumour at school that Stephanie and Paula were prostitutes. She supposedly did this because she was upset with the household singling her out for similar accusations. And I get it, I would have done a lot worse, but I kind of get she's upset and she said something at school, and that's that, you would have thought. While at school, Stephanie was jokingly propositioned by a boy who told her that Sylvia had started the rumour about her. Upon returning home that day, Stephanie questioned her about the rumour and she admitted to starting it. Stephanie punched her in response, but Sylvia apologised to her in tears, and Stephanie then also began to cry. However, when Stephanie's boyfriend, 15-year-old Coy Hubbard, heard about the rumour, he brutally attacked Sylvia, slapping her, banging her head against the wall, and flipping her backwards onto the floor. When Gertrude found out, she used a paddle to beat Sylvia. On another occasion, Paula beat Sylvia about the face with such force that she broke her own wrist, having primarily focused her blows upon Sylvia's teeth and eyes. Later, Paula used the cast on her wrist to further beat her. Gertrude repeatedly falsely accused Sylvia of engaging in prostitution, delivering rants to her regarding the filthiness of prostitution and women in general. Gertrude would later occasionally force Jenny to strike her own sister, beating Jenny if she did not comply. Coy, who is Stephanie's boyfriend, and several of his classmates frequently visited the Banaszewski residence to both physically and verbally torment Sylvia, often collaborating with Gertrude's children and Gertrude herself. With the active encouragement of Gertrude, these neighbourhood children routinely beat Sylvia, sometimes using her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, lacerating her body, burning her skin with lit cigarettes in excess of 100 times, and severely injuring her genitals. To entertain Gertrude, this is explicit. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced at one point to strip naked in the family living room and masturbate with a glass Pepsi Cola bottle in their presence, with Gertrude stating to all present that this act of humiliation was for Sylvia, quote, to prove to Jenny what kind of girl you are. Gertrude eventually forbade Sylvia from attending school after she confessed to having stolen a gym suit from the school due to Gertrude having refused to purchase the clothing for her. For this act of theft, Gertrude whipped Sylvia with a 3-inch wide police belt. Gertrude then switched her conversation to the evils of premarital sex before repeatedly kicking Sylvia in the genitals as Stephanie rallied to Sylvia's defence, shouting, quote, she didn't do anything. Gertrude then burned her fingertips with matches before further whipping her. A few days later, Gertrude repeatedly whipped Jenny with the police belt after she reportedly stole a single tennis shoe from the school to wear on her strong foot. The sisters were fearful of notifying either family members or adults at their school of increasing incidents of abuse and neglect they were enduring, as both were afraid that doing so would only worsen their predicament. And coming from an abusive childhood myself, you either won't be believed. I totally get it. Just a side note here, I heard this story on another YouTube channel who often does true crime stories, and they were like, well, why didn't they speak out? Clearly never coming from an abusive background. It's not easy to admit it to yourself. It's not and saying it makes it real also, but there is the fear of not being believed. And not only that, if someone was to bring it up to your abuser, it's going to get worse, without doubt. Okay, Jenny in particular struggled against the urge to notify family members, as she had been threatened by Gertrude, and she would herself be abused and tortured to the same degree as her sister if she did so. Therefore proving my point. Jenny was also subjected to bullying by girls in her neighbourhood, in addition to occasionally being ridiculed or beaten whenever she alluded to Sylvia's situation. In July and August, both Lester and Betty would occasionally return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters whenever their travel schedule afforded them the opportunity. The last occasion Lester and Betty visited their daughters was in late August. On this occasion, neither girl exhibited any visible signs of distress about their mistreatment to their parents. This was likely because both were in the presence of Gertrude and or her children. And again, this happened to me. My mum kept asking me what was wrong. She noticed a massive decline in my personality and things, and she kept saying, what is wrong? Yeah, are you doing drugs? Are you in trouble with a boyfriend? But he was always around, so I couldn't say, well, actually it's him. So again, things would get worse. And would you be believed? And in my case, would my mum stand by him? Turned out she didn't. But yeah. So I just bringing this up from a personal standpoint that I totally get where these sisters are coming from at this moment in time. Almost immediately after Lester and Betty had left the Banaszewski household on their final visit, and it's sad because it's the last time they saw Sylvia, Gertrude turned to face Sylvia and stated, quote, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia, now they're gone?" On one occasion in September, the girls encountered their older sister Diana at a local park. Both Jenny and Sylvia informed Diana about the abuse they were enduring at the hands of their caregiver, adding that Sylvia was being specifically targeted for physical abuse and almost always for things she had neither said nor done. Neither sister mentioned the actual address where they resided, and initially Diana believed her sisters must be exaggerating their claims regarding the scope of their mistreatment. Again, not being believed. Several weeks prior to this, Sylvia and Jenny had encountered Diana in the same park while in the company of 11-year-old Marie Banaszewski. And Sylvia had been given a sandwich to eat when she mentioned to her sister that she was hungry. Sylvia remained silent about the matter, although Marie revealed this fact to her family. In response, Gertrude accused Sylvia of engaging in gluttony before she and Paula choked and bludgeoned her. The pair then subjected Sylvia to a scalding bath in order to, quote, cleanse her of sin, with Gertrude grabbing Sylvia's hair and repeatedly banging her head against the bath to revive her whenever she fainted. That must have been scorching hot to be fainting in. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighbourhood boy named Michael Monroe phoned the girls' high school to anonymously report that a girl with open sores across her entire body was living at the Banaszewski household. As Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited East New York Street to investigate these claims. Gertrude claimed to the nurse that Sylvia had run away from home the previous week and that she was unaware of her actual whereabouts, adding that she was, quote, out of control, and that her open sores were a result of Sylvia's refusal to maintain decent personal hygiene. Gertrude further claimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school made no further investigations concerning her welfare, i.e. let down. The immediate neighbours of the Banaszewski family were a middle-aged couple named Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion. Both initially viewed Gertrude as an ideal caregiver for the girls, and both had visited the Banaszewski residence on 2 occasions while the girls had been under Gertrude's care. And you would think that having your neighbours round, you would behave yourself. On both occasions, Raymond and Phyllis, the next door neighbours, witnessed Paula physically abusing Sylvia, who on both occasions had a black eye, and openly boasting about her mistreatment of Sylvia to them. Upon their second visit to Gertrude's house, both observed Sylvia to appear extremely meek and somewhat zombified in nature. Nonetheless, they never reported Sylvia's evident mistreatment to the authorities. Again, let down. On or about October the 1st, Diana, the older sister, discovered that her sisters were temporarily residing at the Banaszewski residence. She visited the property in an attempt to initiate regular contact. Gertrude, however, refused Diana entrance to the property, stating that she, quote, received permission from their parents not to allow either of the girls to see her. She then ordered Diana off her property. Approximately 2 weeks later, Diana encountered Jenny by chance close to the home and inquired as to Sylvia's welfare. She was informed, quote, I can't tell you or I'll get into trouble. Due to the increase in the frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment she was subjected to, Sylvia gradually became incontinent. She was denied any access to the bathroom, being forced to wet herself. As a form of punishment on her incontinence, on the 6th of October, Gertrude threw Sylvia into the basement and tied her up. Here, Sylvia was often kept naked, rarely fed, and frequently deprived of water. Occasionally, she was tied to the railing of the basement stairs with her feet barely touching the ground. In the weeks prior to locking Sylvia in the family basement, Gertrude had increasingly abused and tormented Sylvia. She would occasionally falsely claim to the children in her household that either she, herself, or one of them had been the recipient of direct insults from Sylvia, in the hope that this would goad them into belittling or attacking her. On one occasion, Gertrude held a knife aloft and challenged Sylvia to, quote, fight me back, to which Sylvia replied she didn't know how to fight. In response, Gertrude inflicted a light scour wound to her leg. Physical and mental torment such as this was occasionally ceased by the Banaszewskis to watch their favourite television shows. Neighbourhood children were also occasionally charged 5 cents a piece to see the display of Sylvia's body and to humiliate, beat, scold, burn, and ultimately mutilate her. Throughout Sylvia's captivity in the basement, Gertrude frequently, with the assistance of her children and the neighbourhood children, restrained and gagged Sylvia before placing her in a bathtub filled with scalding water and proceeding to rub salt into her wounds. On one occasion, Gertrude and her 12-year-old son, John Jr., rubbed urine and feces from Gertrude's 1-year-old son's diaper into Sylvia's mouth before giving her a cup half filled with water and stating the water was all that she would receive for the remainder of that day. On October the 22nd, John Jr. tormented Sylvia by offering to allow her to eat a bowl of soup with her fingers and then quickly taking it away when Sylvia, by this stage suffering from extreme malnourishment, attempted to eat the food. Gertrude eventually allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs on the condition that she learned not to wet herself. That night, Sylvia whispered to Jenny to secretly give her a glass of water before falling asleep. The following morning, Gertrude discovered that Sylvia had urinated on herself. As a punishment, Sylvia was forced to insert an empty Coca-Cola glass bottle in the presence of you can guess where, in the presence of the Banaszewski children before Gertrude ordered her into the basement. Gertrude called Sylvia upstairs to the kitchen. Somehow the conversation got around to tattooing. Gertrude asked Sylvia whether she knew what a tattoo was. She said, quote, "You branded my children, so now I'm going to brand you." Shortly thereafter, Gertrude shouted for Sylvia to return to the kitchen, then ordered her to strip naked before she began carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Sylvia's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to finish the branding, she instructed one of the neighbourhood children present, 14-year-old Richard Hobbs, to finish etching the words into Sylvia's flesh as she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. In what Hobbs would later insist were short, light etchings, he continued to brand the text into Sylvia's abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Both Hobbs and 10-year-old Shirley Banaszewski then led Sylvia into the basement, where each proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S, though they applied one section of the loop backwards, and this deep burn scar would resemble the number 3. Gertrude later taunted Sylvia by claiming she would never be able to marry due to the words carved on her stomach stating, "Sylvia, what are you going to do now? You can't get married now. What are you going to do?" Weeping, Sylvia replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do." Later that day, Sylvia was forced to display the carving to neighbourhood children, with Gertrude claiming that she had received the inscription at a sex party. That night, Sylvia confided to her sister, quote, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." This has to be the worst true crime case I have covered. I'm crying. The following day, Gertrude woke Sylvia, then forced her to write a letter as she dictated the contents, which were intended to mislead her parents into believing their daughter had run away from the Banaszewski residence. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Sylvia after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted this extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Sylvia had written this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and leave her there to die. After she had finished writing the letter, Sylvia was then again tied to the stair railing and offered crackers to eat, although she refused to eat them, saying, quote, Give it to the dog, I don't want it. In response, Gertrude forced the crackers into Sylvia's mouth before she and John Jr. beat her, particularly around the stomach, which is already intensely sore due to the, quote, branding. On October the 25th, Sylvia attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing a conversation between Gertrude and John Jr. pertaining to the family's plan to abandon her to die. She attempted to flee to the front door. However, due to her extensive injuries and general weakness, Gertrude caught her before she could escape the property. Sylvia was then given toast to eat, but was unable to consume the food due to her extreme state of dehydration. Gertrude forced the toast into her mouth before repeatedly striking her face with a curtain rod until sections of the instrument were bent into right angles. Coy, which was Stephanie's boyfriend, then took the curtain rod from Gertrude and struck Sylvia one further time, rendering her unconscious. Gertrude then dragged Sylvia into the basement. That evening, Sylvia desperately attempted to alert neighbours by screaming for help and hitting the walls of the basement with a spade. One immediate neighbour of the Banaszewskis would later inform police she had heard the desperate commotion and that she had identified the source as emanating from the basement of 3850 East New York Street, but that the noise had suddenly ceased at approximately 3 a.m. She decided not to inform police about the disturbance. By the morning of October 26, Sylvia was unable to either speak or correctly coordinate the movement of her limbs. Gertrude did move Sylvia into the kitchen and, having propped her back against a wall, attempted to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, although she threw Sylvia to the floor in frustration when Sylvia wasn't able to correctly move the glass of milk to her lips. She was then returned to the basement. Shortly thereafter, Sylvia became delirious, repeatedly moaning and mumbling. When Paula asked her to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia was unable to recite anything past the first 4 letters or to raise herself off the ground. In response, Paula verbally threatened her to either stand up or she would inflict a long jump upon her. Gertrude then ordered Sylvia, who had defecated, to clean herself. That afternoon, several of Sylvia's other tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia jerkingly moved her arms in an apparent attempt to point at the faces of the tormentors she could recognise, making statements such as, "You're Ricky," and "You're Gertie," before Gertrude shouted, "Shut up, you know who I am." Minutes later, Sylvia unsuccessfully attempted to bite into a rotten pear she had been given to eat, stating she could feel the looseness in her teeth. Upon hearing this, Jenny replied, quote, "Don't you remember, Sylvia, your front tooth got knocked out when you were 7. Jenny then left Sylvia in the basement to perform gardening chores for neighbours in the hopes of earning spending money. In an attempt to wash Sylvia, a laughing John Jr. sprayed her with a garden hose brought to the house that afternoon by Randy Lepper at Gertrude's request. Sylvia again desperately attempted to exit the basement, but collapsed before she could reach the stairs. In response to this effort, Gertrude stamped upon Sylvia's head before standing and staring at her for several moments. Shortly after 5:30 p.m, Richard Hobbs returned to the Banaszewski residence and immediately proceeded to the basement. He slipped on the wet basement stairs and fell heavily onto the floor of the basement, to be confronted with the sight of Stephanie crying and cuddling Sylvia's emaciated and lacerated body after she had been ordered by her mother to clean Sylvia. Stephanie and Richard then decided to give Sylvia a warm soapy bath and dress her in new clothes. They then laid her upon a mattress in one of the bedrooms as Sylvia muttered her final wish that her, quote, daddy was here, and that Stephanie would take her home. Stephanie then turned to her younger sister, Shirley, exclaiming, "Oh, she'll be all right." When Stephanie realised that Sylvia was not breathing, she attempted to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as Gertrude repeatedly shouted to the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her death. Sylvia was 16 years old when she finally succumbed to her injuries. Gertrude initially beat Sylvia's corpse with a book, shouting, "Faker, faker," in order to rouse her. However, she soon panicked and instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When the police arrived at her address at approximately 6:30 p.m, Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's emaciated, extensively bludgeoned and mutilated body laying upon a soiled mattress in the bedroom before handing them the letter she had forced Sylvia to write previously by her dictation. She also claimed that she had been doctoring the child for an hour or more prior to her death, having applied rubbing alcohol to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid before she had died. She added that Sylvia had earlier run away from home with several teenage boys before returning to her house earlier that afternoon, bare-breasted and clutching the note. Clutching a Bible, Paula, having stated to all present in the household that Sylvia's death was, quote, meant to happen, then glanced in Jenny's direction and calmly stated, quote, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." As previously instructed by Gertrude, Jenny recited the rehearsed version of events leading to Sylvia's death to police before whispering to the officers, quote, "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The formal statement provided by Jenny prompted officers to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie and John Jr. on suspicion of Sylvia's murder within hours of discovery of her body. The same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same offences. The three eldest Banaszewski children, plus Coy Hubbard, were placed in the custody of a nearby juvenile centre. The younger children and Richard Hobbs were detained at Indianapolis Children's Guardians Home, All were held without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia's death. Now, if this case was not shocking enough, although by October 27, which is the day after Sylvia had passed away, she confessed to having known their kids, particularly her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard, had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia, stating, quote, Paula did most of the damage. Coy Hubbard did a lot of the beating. She's thrown her oldest child under the bus in order to save her own skin. Gertrude further admitted to having forced the girl to sleep in the basement on approximately 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. She became evasive when one officer stated the likely reasons Sylvia had become incontinent were her mental distress and injury to her kidneys. Lacking any remorse, Paula signed a statement admitting to having beaten Sylvia about the backside with her mother's police belt, once breaking her wrist on Sylvia's jaw and inflicting other acts of brutality, including pushing her down the stairs into the basement 2 or 3 times and inflicting a black eye. John Jr. admitted to having spanked Sylvia on 1 occasion, adding that, quote, most of the time I used my fists to abuse her. He admitted to having burned Sylvia with matches on several occasions, adding that his mother had repeatedly burned the child with cigarettes. Richard Hobbs and Gertrude, at a hearing before Marion County Judge Harry Zaclan, November 1st, 1965, both were formally charged with murder on this date. 5 other neighbourhood children who had participated in Sylvia's abuse, Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene Maguire, Judy Duke and Anna Cisco, had also been arrested by October 29. All were charged with causing injury to person, and each was subsequently released into the custody of their parents under a subpoena to appear as witnesses at the upcoming trial. The autopsy of Sylvia's body revealed that she had suffered in excess of 150 separate wounds across her entire body, in addition to being extremely emaciated at the time of her death. Seriously malnourished is what that means. The wounds themselves varied in location, nature, severity, and the stage of healing. Her injuries included burns, severe bruising, extensive muscle and nerve damage. Her genital area was almost swollen shut, although an examination determined that her hymen was still intact, discrediting Gertrude's assertions Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant, a prostitute, and promiscuous. All of Sylvia's fingernails were broken backwards, and most of the external layers of her skin upon the face, breasts, neck, and right knee had been peeled or receded. Sylvia had evidently bitten through her lips, partially severing sections of them from her face. The official cause of Sylvia's death was listed by coroner Dr. Arthur Keeble as a subdural hematoma due to her receiving a severe blow to her right temple. Both the shock she had primarily suffered due to the severe and prolonged damage inflicted to her skin, her subcutaneous tissue, plus the severe malnutrition were listed as contributing factors to her death. Rigor mortis had fully developed at the time of the discovery of her body, indicating Sylvia may have been deceased for up to 8 hours before found. Although Dr. Kebbell did note Sylvia had been recently bathed, possibly after death, and that this act could have hastened the loss of body temperature and therefore speeding the onset of rigor mortis. The funeral service for Sylvia was conducted at the Russell and Hitch Funeral Home in Lebanon on the afternoon of October the 29th. The service was officiated by the Reverend Lewis Gibson, with more than 100 mourners in attendance. Sylvia's grey casket remained open throughout the ceremony, with a portrait of her taken prior to July 1965 adorning her coffin. In his eulogy, the Reverend Gibson stated, quote, "We all have our time of passing, but we won't suffer like our little sister suffered during the last days of her life." Following this service, Sylvia's casket was placed by pallbearers in a hearse and driven to the Oak Hill Cemetery to be interred. This hearse was one of a 14-vehicle procession to drive to the cemetery for Sylvia's burial. On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude and 2 of her 3 eldest children, Paula and John Jr. Also indicted were Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard. All were charged with having repeatedly struck, beaten, kicked and otherwise inflicting a culmination of fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. 3 weeks prior to the filing of the indictments against the 5 defendants, Stephanie had been released from custody, with her attorney successfully contending the state had insufficient evidence to support any murder or culmination of fatal injuries charges against her. Stephanie waived her immunity from any potential impending prosecution while agreeing to testify against her family and any other individuals charged with abusing and murdering Sylvia. Quote, Paula represented the situation as one in which the girl Sylvia had become quite withdrawn in her behaviour to the extent that she refused to eat and showed no response to pain. At a formal pre-trial hearing held on March the 16th, 1966, several psychiatrists testified before Judge Saul Isaac Rabb. We will just call him Judge Rabb, as to their conclusions regarding psychiatric evaluations they had conducted upon 3 individuals indicted upon Sylvia's murder. These experts testified that all 3 were mentally competent to stand trial. The trial of Gertrude Banaszewski, her children Paula and John, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard began on the 18th of April 1966. All were tried together before Judge Rabb at Indianapolis City County Building. Initial jury selection began on this date and continued for several days. The prosecution consisted of Leroy New and Marjorie Wesner, who announced their intention to seek the death penalty for all 5 defendants on the 16th of April. They successfully argued before Judge Rabb that all the defendants should be tried together, as they were ultimately charged with acting in concert in their collective crimes against Sylvia, and that as such, if each were tried separately, neither judge nor jury could hear testimony relating to a total picture of the accumulation of offences committed. Each prospective juror was questioned by counsels for both prosecution and defence in relation to their opinions regarding capital punishment being a just penalty for first-degree murder, and whether a mother was actually responsible for the, quote, deportment of her children. Jurors who expressed any opposition to the death penalty were excused from duty by Leroy New. Any who either worked with children, expressed prejudice against an insanity defence, or repulsion regarding the actual horrific nature of Sylvia's death were excused by defence counsels. I mean, how can you not be repulsed at this horrific... horrific doesn't even cover that. Gertrude was defended by William Erbecker. Paula was defended by Richard Rice. Richard Hobbs was defended by James Nedder. John Jr. and Coy Hubbard were defended by Forrest Bowman. The attorneys for Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, Paula and John Jr. claimed they had been pressured into participating in Sylvia's torment, abuse and torture by Gertrude. Gertrude herself pled not guilty by reason of insanity. One of the first witnesses to testify on behalf of the prosecution was Deputy Coroner Charles Ellis, who testified on April 29th as to the intense pain Sylvia had suffered, stating that her fingernails were broken backwards, numerous deep cuts and punctures covered much of her body, and that her lips were, quote, essentially in shreds, due to her having repeatedly bitten and chewed upon them. Ellis further testified that Sylvia had been in an acute state of shock for between 2 and 3 days prior to her death, and that Sylvia may have been in too advanced a state of shock to offer much resistance to any form of subjected treatment in her final hours. Although he emphasised that aside from the extensive swelling inside and around her genitalia, Sylvia's body bore no evidence of direct sexual molestation. Jenny, watching the proceedings of the trial, she instigated the investigation and the subsequent arrest of her sister's torturers and murderers. On the 2nd and 3rd of May, Jenny testified against all 5 defendants, stating that each had repeatedly and extensively, both physically and emotionally, abused her sister, adding that Sylvia had done nothing to provoke the assaults, and that there had been no truth in either the rumours she had been falsely accused of spreading or the slurs each had made against Sylvia's character. During her testimony, Jenny stated the abuse her sister, and to a much lesser degree she herself, had endured began approximately 2 weeks after they had begun to live in Gertrude's household, and that as the abuse her sister was forced to endure escalated, Sylvia had occasionally been able to produced tears due to her acute state of dehydration. Jenny burst into tears as she recalled how just days before Sylvia died, she had said to her, quote, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I am going to die. I can tell it." Sections of Jenny's testimony were later corroborated by that of Randy Lepper, who stated he had once witnessed Sylvia crying, but that she had shed no actual tears. He also testified to having witnessed Stephanie strike Sylvia real hard after her mother had ordered her to remove her clothes in his presence. He then visibly smirked as he confessed to having himself beaten Sylvia on anywhere between 10 and 40 separate instances. On the 10th of May, a Baptist minister named Roy Julian testified to having known a teenage girl was being abused in the Banaszewski household, although he had failed to report this information to authorities, as having been informed by Gertrude that Sylvia had, quote, made advances to men for money. He had believed the girl was being punished for soliciting. The same day, 13-year-old Judy Duke also testified, admitting to having witnessed Sylvia once endure salt being rubbed into sores upon her legs until she screamed. Duke also testified to one occasion where she witnessed 10-year-old Shirley Banaszewski rip open Sylvia's blouse, to which Richard Hobbs had made the casual remark, quote, "Everybody's having fun with Sylvia." The following day, Gertrude testified in her own defence. She denied any responsibility for Sylvia's prolonged abuse, torment and ultimate death, claiming her children and other children within her neighbourhood must have committed the acts within her home, which she described as being, quote, such a madhouse. She also added that she had been too preoccupied with her own ill health and depression to control her children. In response to questioning relating to whether she had physically abused the Lykin sisters, Gertrude claimed that although she had, quote, started to spank Sylvia on one occasion, she was emotionally unable to finish doing so and had not hit the child on any further occasions. She denied any knowledge of Sylvia having ever endured any beating, scolding, branding or burning within her home. 2 days later, Richard Hobbs testified in his own defence, describing how Gertrude had called Sylvia to the kitchen on October the 23rd and stated to her, quote, "You have branded my children, so now I'm going to brand you." Hobbs testified, Gertrude had begun etching the insult into Sylvia's abdomen before asking him to finish the task. Although Hobbs testified, this act of branding had brought blood to the surface of Sylvia's flesh and that Sylvia had begged him to stop, he remained adamant the section of branding he had inflicted had been light. He further testified that he had initially believed Sylvia would not be at the Banaszewski household on October 26, as Gertrude had informed him she intended to, quote, get rid of Sylvia the prior day. He further stated that after Sylvia's death, he had simply returned home to watch the rest of the Lloyd Thaxton show. When Marie Banaszewski was called to the stand as a witness for the defence, she broke down and admitted that she had heated the needle which Hobbs had used to brand Sylvia's abdomen. She also testified as to her mother's indifference to Sylvia's evident distress in relation to the physical and mental abuse she had increasingly suffered, with her mother's full knowledge, stating that on one occasion Gertrude had sat upon a chair and crocheted while she watched a neighbourhood girl named Anna Cisco attack Sylvia. Marie added that although all 5 defendants had repeatedly physically and mentally tormented Sylvia, she had most often witnessed her mother and sister committing these acts before her mother had forced Sylvia to live in the basement, where the abuse had further escalated and she ultimately died. Another witness to testify on behalf of the prosecution, Grace Sargent, stated how she had sat close to Paula on a church bus, and had heard her openly bragging about breaking her own wrists due to the severity of a beating she had inflicted to Sylvia's face on the 1st of August. She testified Paula had finished her boasting by stating, quote, "I tried to kill her." On the 16th of May, a court-appointed doctor named Dwight Schuster testified on behalf of the prosecution. When questioned by Leroy as to the exhaustive interviews and assessments he had conducted with Gertrude, the doctor stated that she had been evasive and uncooperative. Dr. Schuster testified as to his belief that Gertrude was sane and fully in control of her actions, adding that she had been sane in October 1965 and remained sane to this date. Dr. Schuster was subjected to over 2 hours of intense cross-examination by Gertrude's lawyer, William Urbecker, although he remained steadfast that Gertrude was not and had never been psychotic. Deputy Prosecutor Marjorie Wesner delivered the state's closing argument before the jury on behalf of the prosecution. As each defendant, except Richard Hobbs, remained impassive, Wesner recounted the continuous mistreatment Sylvia had endured before her death, emphasising that at no point had Sylvia either provoked any of the defendants or received any medical care beyond occasionally having margarine rubbed into her scalded sections of her face and body. Referencing specific forms and means of abuse and neglect at the defendants' hands and their collective failure to either help Sylvia or deter each other from mistreating her. Wesner described Sylvia's abuse as, quote, stomach-wrenching, and compared her treatment at the hands of all 5 defendants as being the equivalent in severity to that committed against prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Quote, "There was practically no fat on Sylvia's body. She hadn't eaten for a week. We'll never know the pain and suffering that Sylvia endured. The best evidence of that was the picture of her lips that were bitten into shreds." In reference to the premeditated nature of Sylvia's death, Wesner pointed the jury's attention to the notes Gertrude had forced Sylvia to write on October the 24th, stating, Gertrude knew on the 24th of October she was going to hold these notes until she and the rest of the defendants had completed the murder of Sylvia. Holding aloft a portrait of Sylvia taken before July 1965, Wesner added, "I wish she were here today with eyes as in this picture, full of hope and anticipation." William Urbecker was the first defence attorney to deliver his closing argument before the jury. He's defending Gertrude. He attempted to portray his client as being insane and thus able to appreciate the severity or criminality of her actions, stating, "I condemn her for being a murderess. That's what I do. But I say she's not responsible because she's not all here." He then tapped his head to emphasise his reference to her state of mind before adding, "If this woman is sane, put her in the electric chair. She committed acts of degradation that you wouldn't commit on a dog. She has to be crazy, or she wouldn't have permitted that. You'll have to live with your conscience for the rest of your life if you send an insane woman to the electric chair." Holding aloft an autopsy photograph of Sylvia, he instructed the jury, "Look at this exhibit. Look at the lips on that girl. How sadistic can a person get? The woman is stark mad." He then referred to the earlier testimony of a psychiatrist who had called into question Gertrude's sanity before concluding his argument. Forrest Bowman began his closing argument in an openly critical manner as he attacked the decision of the prosecution to seek the death penalty for juveniles. Now he is defending John Jr. and Coy Hubbard, and he stated, "I would like to have an hour of the jury's time to explain why 16-year-olds and 13-year-olds should not be put to death." Refraining from acknowledging the catalogue of atrocities each had inflicted upon Sylvia, he repeatedly emphasised his client's age, stating each was only guilty of assault and battery before seeking a verdict of not guilty for each youth. George Rice began his closing argument by decrying the fact that Paula and the other defendants had been tried jointly, sidestepping the multiple instances of testimony delivered at trial describing Paula and her mother as by far the most enthusiastic participants in Sylvia's physical abuse. Rice claimed that the evidence presented against his client did not equate to her actual guilt of murder. He then ended his closing argument with a plea for the jury to return a verdict of not guilty on a girl who had, quote, "gone through the indignity of being tried in an open court." James Nedder began his closing argument in defence of Richard Hobbs by referring to the loss of Sylvia, stating, "She had a right to live. In my own heart, I cannot remember a girl so much sinned against and abused." He then referred to Hobbs' courage in opting to testify in his own defence and the, quote, "savage and relentless cross-examination" to which he had been subjected to by Leroy. Nedder attempted to portray his client as a follower-type personality who acted under the control of Gertrude, suggesting that he had not carved part of the obscene insult into Sylvia's abdomen at Gertrude's request. Hobbs could well have been a state's witness as opposed to Stephanie Banaszewski. He then referred to Jenny's overall failure to notify authorities of her sister's abuse until she had already died, describing her as, quote, "a sister who could limp 3.5 miles to a park but couldn't take 2 or 3 steps out into New York Street to beg for help." Nedder ended his closing argument by requesting a verdict of not guilty, stating Hobbs was, quote, "guilty of immaturity and gross lack of judgment, but not the crime of murder." Leroy rebutted the defence counsel's closing arguments by promising to, quote, "speak through the mangled and shredded lips of Sylvia Likens. I see her everywhere I look." outlining the catalogue of mistreatment Sylvia had endured prior to her death at the hands of each of the defendants. Leroy directly addressed criticism he had earlier received from Forrest Bowman in his closing argument regarding the prosecution, quote, cross-examining children, stating, "The prosecutor's job is to present the evidence to the best of our ability. Now let's look at some of the responsibilities here. Each one of the 5 defendants had first and foremost the responsibility to leave Sylvia Likens alone. We had the responsibility to bring all the evidence we could find that could explain this crime." Referring to the sentimental closing arguments made by various defence counsels regarding reasoning and motivation for their clients' actions, their attempts to divert responsibility to other defendants or participants, and their clients' collective failure to either help Sylvia or notify the authorities, Leroy added, "All we hear is whining appeal. Anything but blame where the blame belongs." He then speculated as to the reason Sylvia did not try to escape from the Banaszewski household prior to the abuse, increasingly escalating in the final weeks of her life, stating, "I think she trusted in man. I think she did not believe these people would do this and continue to do it." He concluded his closing argument by emphasising the defendants' unison in their collective mistreatment of Sylvia, before asking the jury to dismiss arguments made by various defence counsels regarding who may have actually inflicted the fatal blow to Sylvia's head, stating, "Every mark on that girl's body contributed directly to her death. The subdural hematoma was the ultimate blow. This is the most hideous thing Indiana has ever seen, and I hope will ever see." Not a shred of evidence has been produced indicating any defendant was suffering from a form of mental illness. He again requested the death penalty for each defendant, stating to the jury, "The issue here is not about the electric chair or a hospital, but about law and order. Will we shy away from the most diabolical case to ever come before a court or jury? If you go below the death penalty, in this case, you will lower the value of human life by that much for each defendant. The blood of this girl will forevermore be on their souls." The trial of the 5 defendants lasted 17 days before the jury retired to consider its verdict. On the 19th of May 1966, after deliberating for 8 hours, the panel of 8 men and 4 women found Gertrude Banaszewski guilty of first-degree murder, recommending a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula Banaszewski guilty of second-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard and John Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing Judge Rabb pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children burst into tears and attempted to console each other as Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard remained impassive. On the 25th of May, Gertrude and Paula were formally sentenced to life imprisonment. On the same day, Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Jr. each received sentences of 2 to 21 years to be served in the Indiana Reformatory. This is not the end of the story. In September 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the convictions of Gertrude and Paula on the basis that Judge Rabb had denied repeatedly submitted motions by their defense counsel at their original trial for both a change of venue and separate trials. This ruling further stated that the circumstances regarding the prejudicial atmosphere created during their initial trial due to the extensive news media publicity surrounding the case impeded any chance of either appellant receiving a fair trial. The pair were retried in 1971. On this occasion, Paula opted to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than face a retrial. She was sentenced to serve a term of between 2 and 20 years imprisonment for her part in Sylvia's abuse and death. Despite twice unsuccessfully having attempted to escape from prison in 1971, she was released in December 1972. Gertrude, however, was again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Over the course of the following 14 years, Gertrude became known as a model prisoner at the Indiana Women's Prison. By the time of Gertrude's ultimate parole in 1985, she had changed her name to Nadine Van Vossen, which is her middle name and her maiden name. News of Gertrude's impending parole hearing created an uproar throughout Indiana. Jenny and other immediate family members of Sylvia protested against any prospect of her release. The members of 2 anti-crime groups also travelled to Indiana to oppose her potential parole and to publicly support the Likens family. Members of both groups initiated a sidewalk picket campaign over the course of the 2 months. These groups collected over 40,000 signatures from the citizens of Indiana, including signatures obtained from outraged citizens who were too young to contemporarily recollect the case. All signatures gathered demanded that Gertrude remain incarcerated for the remainder of her life. I totally agree. It's insane that they would parole this woman. Within her parole hearing, Gertrude stated her wish that Sylvia's death could, quote, be undone, although she minimised her responsibility for any of her actions, stating, I'm not sure what role I had in Sylvia's death because I was on drugs. I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for whatever happened to Sylvia. What a cop-out. The whole point of a parole hearing is to show remorse. There's none. It's just excuses. Taking Gertrude's good conduct in prison into account, the parole board marginally voted in favour of granting her parole. She was released from prison on the 4th of December 1985. Following her 1985 release from prison, Gertrude relocated to Iowa. She never accepted full responsibility for Sylvia's prolonged torment and death, insisting she was unable to precisely recall any of her actions in the months of Sylvia's prolonged and increasing abuse and torment within her home. She primarily blamed her actions upon medication she had been prescribed to treat not her depression, no, her asthma. Gertrude lived in relative obscurity in Iowa until her death due to lung cancer on June the 16th, 1990, aged 61. Reflecting upon the news of Gertrude's death and the issues raised pertaining to her sanity at both of her trials, John Dean, a former reporter for the Indianapolis Star who had provided extensive coverage of the case, would state in 2015, "I never thought she was insane. I thought she was a downtrodden, mean woman." In reference to Gertrude's actual motive for tormenting and ultimately murdering Sylvia, attorney Forrest Bowman in 2014 said, "She had a miserable life. What I think this was ultimately about was jealousy." And he was the one defending John Jr. and Coy Hubbard. Following her 1972 parole, Paula assumed a new identity. She worked as an aide to a school counsellor for 14 years at the Iowa Beeman Conrad Liscum Union Witten School. Say that 5 times fast. Having changed her name to Paula Pace, and having concealed the truth regarding her criminal history to the school when applying for the position. She was fired in 2012 when the school discovered her true identity. Paula reportedly lives in a small town in Iowa. She is married and has 2 children. The baby daughter to whom she had given birth while being tried in 1966 and whom she named after her mother was later adopted. The murder charges initially filed against Gertrude's second eldest daughter, Stephanie, who was 15 at the time, were ultimately dropped after she agreed to turn state's evidence against the other defendants. Stephanie assumed a new name and became a school teacher. She later married and has several children. Stephanie currently lives in Florida. Following the arrest of their mother in Marion County, Department of Public Welfare placed Marie, Shirley, and James in the care of separate foster families. The surname of all 3 children was legally changed to Blake in the 1960s after their father regained their custody. Marie died of natural causes on the 8th of June 2017 at the age of 62. Dennis Lee Wright Jr. was later adopted. His adoptive mother named him Denny Lee White. He died on the 5th of February 2012 at the age of 47. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Jr. each served less than 2 years in the Indiana Reformatory before being granted parole on the 27th of February 1968. Richard Hobbs died of lung cancer on the 2nd of January 1972 at the age of 21, less than 4 years after his release. Coy Hubbard remained in Indiana and never attempted to change his name. Throughout his adult life, Hubbard was repeatedly imprisoned for various criminal offences. Shortly after the January 2007 premiere of the crime drama film An American Crime. Hubbard was fired from his job. He died of a heart attack in Shelbyville, Indiana, on the 23rd of June of that year at the age of 56. I have seen An American Crime. It was on Amazon Prime. Very, very tragic. The ending, wow, powerful. John Jr. lived in relative obscurity under the alias of John Blake. He became a lay minister, frequently hosting counselling sessions for children of divorced parents. Several decades after his release, John Jr. issued a statement in which he acknowledged the fact he and his co-defendant should have been sentenced to more severe term of punishment, adding that young criminals are not beyond rehabilitation and describing how he had become a productive citizen. He died of diabetes in the Lancaster General Hospital on the 19th of May 2005 at the age of 52. The injury to person charges brought against the other juveniles known to have actively physically, mentally and emotionally tormented Sylvia, Anna Cisco, Judy Duke, Michael Monroe, Darlene Maguire and Randy Lepper were later dropped. Cisco ultimately married. She died on October the 23rd, 1996, at the age of 44, already a grandmother. Lepper, who had visibly smirked as he testified to having hit Sylvia up to 40 separate occasions, died at the age of 56 on the 14th of November 2010. Jenny, but she later married Leonard Wade and had 2 children, although she remained traumatised by the abuse she had been forced to watch her sister endure. For the remainder of her life, Jenny was dependent upon anxiety medication. Jenny died of a heart attack on the 23rd of June 2004 at the age of 54. 14 years prior to her death, Jenny Wade had viewed Gertrude's obituary in a newspaper. She clipped the section from the newspaper and then mailed it to her mother with a note reading, quote, "Some good news. Damn old Gertrude died. Ha 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 ha. I'm so happy about that." The Likin parents, Betty, died in 1998 and Lester died in 2013. In the years prior to her own death, Jenny had repeatedly emphasised no blame should be placed upon either of her parents for placing her and Sylvia in the care of Gertrude, stating all her parents had done was trust Gertrude's promise to actually care for them until their return. The house at 3850 East New York Street, in which Sylvia was tortured and murdered, stood vacant for many years after her death and the arrest of her tormentors. The property gradually became dilapidated. The house itself was demolished on the 23rd of April 2009, and the site where the house once stood is now a church parking lot. If you have reached the end of this episode, hats off to you. Thank you so much for joining me. I know today's episode has been very graphic, very tragic. It has really upset me. I have cried several times doing this episode, so I think it's important to remember Sylvia and share her story. I know it has been done several times on YouTube. I first heard about it a long time ago via a YouTube channel who does true crime. It angered me, to be honest, because she was like, well, why didn't they tell anyone at school? Well, why didn't they do this? Well, why didn't they do that? It's not easy. As I said throughout the episode, I am a child of abuse. Physical, mental, emotional, sexual. You can't just go around telling people. It's not easy. And you're brainwashed as well. You live in constant fear of repercussions. And I did speak out to several people who, in their answer, said, well, I'm his best mate, what do you want me to do about it? Another one said, it's none of our business, stay out of it. So there you go. This is not my story, this is Sylvia's. And so tragic, absolutely heartbreaking. I do find it ironic that all the perpetrators involved had cancer or diabetes. They died relatively young. And God bless Jenny as well. I mean, not only was she abused to a much lesser degree in her words, but to watch her sister and then have Paula turn around and say, well, if you want to stay with us, we'll treat you like one of our own. You should have done that for the sake of 4 or 5 months where she offered to look after her. Anyway, not getting annoyed again. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have made it this far, let me do know in the comments. And of course, as always, share your thoughts. Very, very heavy, very, very tragic. So thank you if you have made it this far. Yeah, let's just remember Sylvia. This one has now got to be the number one worst, diabolical, sadistic case that I have ever covered. Fred West is always going to be up there. A couple of others that I am working on and researching are just horrendous. But this case, and to come from a mother, I think that's the most shocking thing. A mother, and she was hell-bent on persecuting Sylvia for no real reason, but to tarnish her as promiscuous and a prostitute and all that when her own daughter was 3 months pregnant at the age of 17. Beggars belief, guys. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Thank you so much for joining me. I know it's a long one. I did toy breaking it up, but I want to keep it all as one case. I don't like the word story. Thank you for spending your time with me and learning about Sylvia. If you hadn't already known about Sylvia Likens and Gertrude, I shall see you in another episode very, very soon. Today does mark her anniversary. I kind of want to say 21st anniversary, but I don't actually know the math. So she died in 1965. Today is 2021. Let me know in the comments. Look after each other, guys. And I'll see you soon in another true crime episode.